We'll start officially. So welcome. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from the many places around this beautiful country of ours that we meet from today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. For those who don't know, I'm Glenn Poole, CEO of the Australian Men's Health Forum. We're a national and virtual organisation. Today, I'm joining you from a beautiful little place called Captain Creek, up in Queensland between Bundaberg and Gladstone. Thanks all for being here today. This is the beginnings of a conversation we want to have about mateship in Australia and its connection to men's health. We'll be developing a range of resources. We will be making some recommendations to government, some recommendations to practitioners, but really, we don't have a fixed idea of what that looks about because we just want to start a conversation about mateship and men's health. So I've got some loose sort of slides to sort of shape a conversation, but I really want today to be about a discussion. There's a reason why you're all attracted to be part of this conversation, and I'm sure you all have something to contribute. So jump in at any time, and I'll also provide plenty of opportunity for people to contribute. Chuck stuff in the chat if you want to, any comments, ideas you have, but also it's a reasonably small size group, enough for us to actually give everyone the opportunity to have their say on mic so everyone can hear it as well. So we'd really welcome your contribution. Let me push through a few slides first before we get into a conversation. So we've called this conversation the mateship crisis. I always like to have a bit of a tabloidy headline to get the conversation started. Is it fair to say there's a mateship crisis in Australia? Well, this is the hypothesis of this conversation. Basically, we believe there are too many men in Australia who actually lack the opportunity to build, maintain, and experience quality mateship in their lives. We believe this is a social issue. It's a health issue, and it's not a bold claim. There is plenty of evidence to back this up. It's not a bold claim to say that actually promoting mateship is as important to men's health as tackling things like smoking and risky drinking and physical activity and obesity. This is not in any way unique to Australia. Whilst other countries don't talk about mateship in the way that we do here, certainly people are talking about social connection and loneliness. We know Japan appointed a minister for loneliness a couple of years ago, as did the UK, where it's been estimated that nearly half the population experienced loneliness at some point. And recently there was some interesting research in the USA where someone coined the phrase the friendship recession, and the statistics that they tracked for this over 30 years was that the number of men with at least 6 close friends fell from 55% to 27%, so it halved. And the number of men with in the same period, the number of men with no close friends increased 5-fold, from 3% to 15%. I haven't been able to find equivalent statistics in Australia covering that sort of 30-year period, but we found plenty of data to suggest that for a large number of men, lack of social connection and lack of mateship is a real issue. So I'll just do a little bit of the, what do we actually mean by social connection and how mateship sits within that. And we'll look at some Australian statistics to sort of back up what we're saying. So here's one model of social connection. It talks about how we have different circles of people in our lives. Yes, we have those closest to us. We have good friends, but we also usually have a range of communities, maybe a work community or a social community. And then there's the wider community that we live in. That provides a simple model of social connection. It's a range of circles that we have in our life. So if social connection is positive, then the opposite is sometimes referred to as loneliness, sometimes referred to as social isolation. There is an actual difference there. So loneliness is a subjective feeling. You might be surrounded by people, but feel like the loneliest bloke on the planet. And so loneliness is described as that internal perception that I have no one. Whereas social isolation, it can actually be objectively measured from the outside. It's the bloke in a house on his own, not going out, not meeting people, not at work, so on and so forth. So there's a couple of different concepts within the in the conversation around social connection, but I think it's important to recognize the difference between loneliness and social isolation. It's very possible to experience being lonely whilst having lots of people around you, because for some reason you don't feel authentically connected to them. And there's a whole world of language that's used to study social connection. Here's just 9 different concepts. I'm not going to go through them all, but things like social capital, social inclusion and exclusion, our social identity, our social status, the social networks we have. But the most common phrase used these days is social connection. If we focus on the positive rather than the deficit, the thing that we want people to have ideally is plenty of good quality social connection. And from an Aussie perspective, a part of social connection is definitely mateship. This isn't definitely not a scientific model, but it's just a little slide we use when we're talking about the concept of mateship in community groups, showing that it can range from absolutely no mates or very few mates, where you're isolated or feel lonely, through to being well connected and being completely integrated with your community and having that great sense of belonging. Well, we're clear that if we're going to talk about social connection in Australia, and we're going to talk about men and social connection, that mateship is a real component of that. And from my perspective, mateship is, we like to take a strengths-based approach. We'll talk about what are men good at, not as much as what are men not good at. And from an Australian perspective, I would assert that mateship is a positive quality of Australian masculinity. We hear a lot of conversations about what's wrong with masculinity, but in terms of Aussie masculinity, one of the core values, I would say, of Australian masculinity is mateship, looking out for each other. So why are we even having this conversation as a health organization? Well, there's now masses of data which show that the lack of social connection is linked to poor health outcomes. Real broad range of poor health outcomes. Most significantly, just life expectancy, but also health markers such as obesity and blood pressure, and also risk of particular health issues like stroke and heart disease and dementia later in life. Again, going back to this resource we've already created, which is a presentation called Mateship and Men's Health. Actually, Kim, if I could ask you to share the link to this slide presentation. If you're interested, you can actually download this presentation from our website. If you haven't already, it's free to access. It's part of our Know Your Man Facts series. It's about mateship and men's health. But in that, we talk about how the evidence shows having no mates is bad for your heart. It increases your risk of suicidality, and it has been found, lack of social connection has been found to be as unhealthy as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. If social connection is good for health and that's well established, and the lack of social connection has been recognised as something of a social issue or even a crisis worldwide, well, what's the story for Australian men? So these are some of the data points we've picked up from various Australian studies. So all of these now are Australian data. It ranges from as few as 4% of men saying they have no close friends, right up to like 60% of men saying they've lost contact with really important people in their lives. A lot of the data seems to cluster around the sort of 1 in 4 sort of area. So in terms of the scale of this issue, we estimate that at least 1 in 4 men are impacted by lack of social connection in some way. That's a hell of a lot of blokes. And one of the most recent data points we've found, this comes from the Australian Institute of Health and Wellbeing, is that men are nearly twice as likely to say they have no family or friends to confide in, and that compared to women. So obviously, both women and men experience issues with lack of social connection, but there is a gender dimension to this, certainly. And here's one of the clear indicators that men are nearly twice as likely not to have anyone in their life that they can confide in, either family or friends. And that's nearly 1 in 5 men. So we've looked at some of the data on gender differences. Is this just an issue where we need a whole scale sort of universal approach for everyone, or is there a case for us to actually think about this in a gendered way and have different approaches to men and women? Well, research on how men and women do friendships shows up some quite interesting differences that emerge really early in life. So they seem to emerge right from boyhood and girlhood. And one of the key differences seems to be that men and boys tend to connect through action and doing stuff, whereas women and girls broadly tend to connect more intimately through emotional sharing. Something that wouldn't be a surprise to anyone in this conversation, I'm sure, but what we're saying is there's plenty of research to back this up, and it's something which emerges quite early on in life. Most of the next few slides are sort of global statistics, but they paint this interesting picture of what friendship looks like, and why should we focus on, mateship and men? Well, for most men, their closest friends are usually male, and for most women, their closest friends are usually female. Clearly, it's not a complete binary where men hang out with men and women hang out with women, but there is a clear pattern there. So when we're talking about social connection and men, supporting and encouraging male bonding, male groups is a real part of the solution, because it's working with what men already do. Though what's quite interesting in here as well, in terms of social isolation, is that men are less likely than women to actually have a best friend. One of the findings of the research on the previous slide was that men often are part of larger groups, but less likely to have closer friends. And right across different societies and different age groups, we generally find that, broadly speaking, men find it easier to make friends with men, women find it easier to make friends with women, and men are more likely to have mostly male friends, and women are more likely to have mostly female friends. Although there is some diversity in that. You'll get a small percentage of men who have mostly women friends, small percentage of women who have mostly male friends. Now, this is Australian data, and this is quite recent, from Relationships Australia, and this is more about family relationships, but I think it's really revealing. It adds to the tapestry of what's going on in men's lives, and why mates are particularly important to blokes. So firstly, men and women were asked, well, who are the three most important people in your life? And this could include friends and people outside, and work colleagues, and so on and so forth. But when we actually looked at when they looked at the men and women in families, men are more likely to identify their partner as one of the most important people. And then generally in families, people are far more likely to identify a female relative as being the most important person to them, whether that's a mother, a daughter, or a sister. So what that tells us about men is they're more likely to be reliant on their female partner for their social support, and also they're less likely to be closely connected to broader family members. They're less likely to be identified as an important relationship. So where else do men need to look? Their mates become very important in that respect. Hang on. And then I found this really interesting. So the question was then asked, which relatives in your family would you turn to for different types of support? And there were choices like mother or father, brother or sister, excuse me, phone going off, mother or father, brother or sister, son or daughter, auntie or uncle, nephew and niece. So you could choose between a range of male relatives and female relatives. When asked about who in your family would you talk to if you were down, who would you get help from to help out around the house if you were sick, and who would you choose to enjoy social time with, 70 to 80% of people said they would choose one of the women in their family. And it's only when you got to the sort of like, well, who would you get to help you with jobs around the house or in the garden that you can't do, and that's when the blokes came in. So really sort of gendered pattern within families, that women are there for the kind of like the emotional support, even the fun time, the social time, whereas the blokes, it's about the practical help. So this is very stereotypical, but this is the pattern that emerges from everything we've looked at. And again, to people in this conversation, I'm sure none of this will be surprising. How do blokes typically connect? In larger groups, doing stuff. Often men are very reliant on school or workplace or activities such as sport to build their social connections. You'll have heard this phrase before, but it comes up in the research as well. Men are more likely to do their relationships side by side or shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face. In sheds, of course, outdoors or in outdoor spaces, going fishing, around a barbecue, around a fire, over a beer, watching sport, playing sport, huddled around a machine, or going out for a drive. So very stereotypical, you would think, in 2023, but still, this is what the research is still showing, that men are more likely to do their friendships in these ways. So how then are men's groups in the men's sector responding to that? Well, it's almost as if they've taken that template and just copied it, because we know what are great men's groups doing? Well, they're meeting in sheds. They're meeting around barbecues, Mr. Perfect barbecues all over the country. They're doing presentations in male-dominated workplaces and connecting there. We've seen the growth of men's walk and talk activities in the last 4 or 5 years. There's over 100 of these walk and talks now. I think Billy Beggs is on the on the meet, and they have the Penrith walk and talk on the outskirts of Sydney there, and they'll have up to 500 or 600 blokes turning up in the summer. And we've seen a growth of some really interesting groups emerging in pub settings around a beer. For example, the Tough Guy Book Club, which is now approaching 100 chapters around Australia and a couple overseas as well. So all these groups are working with existing masculine strengths to provide men with opportunities to connect and build mateship. And sporting activity as well. I think these are some of the guys from the Man v Fat program over in WA, which is a fantastic soccer-based weight loss program. And loads of guys meeting around machines, bike rides, car-based activities, and so on and so forth. But it's not just about working with and reinforcing gender stereotypes, because a lot of men's groups are also creating spaces where they may meet men where they are, which is a common phrase in men's work, but they're also working to expand gender norms. I think this is if not your mob in Mackay, Frank, certainly a Shed Happens kind of activity. What's the Frank, jump in? What's the motto of Shed Happens as opposed to men's sheds?
Well, our motto is working on hearts, not projects. So it differentiates us from men's shed. And our other one, which was the favourite saying of our founder, was no bloke ever went backwards with encouragement. No bloke ever went backwards without encouragement. It was Watto, wasn't it? Ian Watson. Yep. Yeah, so a really nice example of how men's groups on the outside might look like just very stereotypical and masculine. Nothing wrong with that. Blokes getting together in a shed, but there's loads of examples where those groups are going beyond the norm and basically in different language. What Frank is saying there is it's not just about getting together and doing stuff. It's about working on hearts. It's about connecting in a more sort of like authentic and an emotional way, but still within the context of a shed. And there's lots of examples like that. Men's gatherings have been a really big part of Australian men's work for years. I think the fellas down in the right hand side there are probably the men's wellbeing mob. Couple of fire circles there. Those have been happening in Australia for at least 30 years. So using that outdoor context, getting together around a fire, but actually the kind of conversations and the sharing that goes on in those events is deep and emotional and authentic. Wayne, do you want to tell us a little bit about this picture? You have to unmute yourself. Yeah,
that's it. I was finding that. So we go bush, we go forward driving, go bush, and We do a lot of deep internal work. Our kind of slogan is getting out, looking in. So that's what we do.
Getting out, hooking in.
Getting out, looking in.
Looking in. Gotcha. Yeah. So again, on the outside, a bunch of blokes going for a drive and doing a bit of camping, activity-based, machine-based. The actual reality is getting out and looking in, deeper inner connection. Man with a pram. I'm not sure if any of the guys from Dad's group are here today, but young fathers out connecting with their kids, meeting for coffees, playing in the park, but also building stronger bonds and relationships. Men's table. I don't know if anyone from men's table is here, but we don't just talk about footy and shit, I think is one of their phrases. I don't know how many men's tables there are now in Australia. That they must be again pushing 100 now, and they meet monthly over a meal, take it in turns to host and build strong, deep relationships with each other. But as you can see, they're meeting together, doing an activity, getting together. There's alcohol involved there. But actually the longer term project is to build strong, authentic connection. So just 2 more slides and I'm going to open up the floor. So our assertion is there is clearly a big enough issue with social connection and mateship in Australia to have us want to sit up and pay attention. 1 in 4 men at least lacking any form of real social connection, and the evidence for the impact that that's having on their health is really robust. It's as damaging as drinking too much or not exercising or smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's a public health issue, and in fact it's not really debated, the evidence on the health impact. Just broadly, not men in particular, but just broadly. I think part of the challenge we have is that a lot of the campaigning is around loneliness. And not only are women, whilst men are more likely to be socially disconnected or lack social connection, women are more likely to report loneliness. Going back to one of those early slides, it's that sort of that feeling, that experience of feeling lonely is something that women report more than men. And so a focus on loneliness tends to exclude or minimize men's experience, because men aren't sitting there going, I'm lonely, but they are actually in reality experiencing social disconnection. I've got no mates, no one cares, might be more of the kind of phrase that a bloke uses. And even within the sort of the loneliness sector, there's a recognition that developing projects that are for lonely people really doesn't attract many people. You know, when you start, but this group is for lonely people, please come along. People it's stigmatizing. People don't want to show up, and I think that's especially the case for men, which is why that sort of focus on, you know, building mateship, building social connection, getting out and connecting with other blokes is much more powerful than come to this group for sad, lonely men. No blokes are ever going to turn up to that. And where there are interventions, understandably, they do tend to be focused on the most vulnerable groups, maybe people with disabilities, the old and the frail. And that's important, but I think more broadly, we need a whole of population approach, which actually just builds community resilience by making mateship as important to our health as exercise and not smoking. And from what evidence I've seen, where there are interventions, they tend to reach more women than men. So this is, a common theme across the men's health sector, whether it's suicide prevention or bowel cancer screening. Lots of health interventions, even though they need to reach more men, tend to be more effective at reaching women. And that's particularly the case. I don't have really detailed evidence, but I've seen a couple of evaluations where 80% of the people engaged by a social connection project were women. So there's definitely an issue there that the work that is happening isn't hitting the mark.
Glenn, one of the problems we have in shared happens is blokes tend to think they have to be broken or
Right.
suffering from some addiction or something to come along.
Yeah.
And that keeps them away. Like we're getting around 50 every month now but there's a lot of blokes who'll say they're coming and then they won't front up.
Yeah,
I think one of our challenges is that we only see them once a month,
right.
and we try and keep in touch by phone sometimes. But yeah, a lot of blokes think they've got to be broken before they have to talk to somebody.
Right. So you're clearly getting through it with some blokes. If you're getting 50 blokes a month, that's extraordinary. But you know, what do you find that works to sort of get over that?
We've varied our program a little bit. Like this Wednesday night, we're going to talk about digital addiction,
Right.
addiction to mobile phones and computers.
Yeah.
We're going to do it in a small group discussion format. So we're going to interview a bloke who's had that addiction and has overcome it.
Yeah.
Then we're going to break the group up into small groups of about 7 or 8 and discuss 3 or 4 questions about what they would do about it and how it's affected their family. And then we'll debrief it at the end. Right.
So you're what I'm hearing is, I mean, obviously you're doing something that works in the sense that you're getting 50 blokes a month. That's extraordinary. I'm hearing the importance of regularity.
Yeah, we're varying it a bit. Normally we'd interview 2 blokes about their life, the good, the bad, the happy and the sad.
Yeah.
But we're doing that sort of probably a third of the time.
Yeah.
Another time we're having these group discussions or we're having a guest speaker.
Great. So yeah, you're doing you're changing up the program to keep it interesting. I really like the fact of your model that you actually, you know, you're saying that blokes think they need to be broken to come, but actually when they get involved, you give every bloke the opportunity to be the hero, to be the star of the show, to actually tell his story.
Yeah.
And so yeah, he's not just there to sort of like receive help. He's actually there to offer something valuable to the rest of the blokes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also hear you're working, and I think this is an important part of how we build social connection into communities, is it takes individuals working hard to connect people, and that stuff that you're doing about phoning around, trying to keep people connected, it doesn't happen on its own. Things do grow organically, but it really takes hard work of individuals like yourself to actually bring people in and include them and connect them and make them part of the community.
Yeah.
Right, thanks, thanks, Frank. Thanks for that contribution.
All right.
Okay, this is last slide. So where I'm beginning to see some potential opportunities here is that clearly, just even looking at those slides of the different men's groups, there are lots of community-based groups and organisations already doing great work, and I think together we can make a collective case for more support, more funding, more focus on the kind of work we're already doing. I think there's clearly quite a bit of work now going on around social connection, but it's missing men. So actually connecting with those people and making the case for more focus on men and boys, I think is important. I think tapping into other agendas and actually recognizing that while we know that social connection, if on its own, is actually a positive outcome, if we can also connect that to initiatives like, you know, that are involving physical activity and improving health, that can really help make the case for doing it. And I think actually putting on the agenda that Mateship has a really important role to play in men's mental health. There's a lot of focus now on men's mental health and suicide prevention. There's no one answer to that. A lot of the focus is how can we get more blokes into clinical practice. But in terms of like building resilience, initiatives that build Mateship make a really strong case there's a really strong case for them being presented as early intervention, resilience building, and potentially suicide prevention initiatives. If we have more social connection at a community level, we will stop more blokes literally falling off the edge of a cliff. So that's all I want to say. I've got a final slide with a couple of questions on. I'm not going to go through these one by one. Here's some sort of some questions to sort of provoke your thinking, but also you're welcome to chip in with any thoughts you have, any observations you have, anything you want to share from your experience. It's over to you. The floor is open. Just jump in or pop in things in the chat box. I think we've got a small enough group just to, we're getting quite big now, so jump in if you want to, but if it gets a bit busy, also use the raise a hand feature.
Hi, Glenn.
Hello.
Lisa McWilliam from Romvale District Health here. And I got involved with you through starting to work on a Men's Health Week for June,
Right.
and found you, so I was quite excited. I had a couple of questions I just wanted to sort of throw out to the group. What about online connectedness? I mean, you mentioned before that, you know, digital addiction can be a problem, but I'm thinking of probably for, well, again, stereotyping, maybe younger people connecting sort of through online games and things like that. Has anyone through the group sort of, or is there any research exploring that side of it? And my other issue was in Robinvale, we're highly, highly multicultural. We have in our small town of about 3,000 people, we speak about 54 different languages here. And that Aussie mateship is a great starting point, but reaching some of the different cultural diversities, I just wondered where people had had success and what people's thoughts or feelings or stories were on that one.
Great questions, Lisa. I know there's probably a couple of guys in the room who are working with culturally and linguistically diverse groups. I'd love to hear from them. I'll just make a quick response on the online stuff. Broadly, a lot of men's groups were almost forced to go online during COVID, and some are still using online connection. But also, I'll dig it out for you. There was an ongoing research project funded by Movember, I think, at one of the universities in Queensland, looking at using online gaming as a way of connecting with the younger men around their mental health. So there's some work there. But I'll, John, I know you've got your hand up, but I'm going to just stick with the multicultural dimension first, because I know I can see Kevin's got his hand up. Kevin from the Gold Coast.
Thank you, Glenn. Yes, I work in a multicultural organizations here on the Gold Coast, and I had the opportunity to be in part of different groups for men. But yeah, when Lisa say it's a really big challenge, because people from different backgrounds find really challenging to be part of the men's group, because first of all, religion is really part of important of the personalities. So when it's religion and different background, when the men have to be the provider, it's still there. Maybe in countries like Australia or UK or USA, be opening to be a man is a little bit easier. But for example, in my case, South America, or could be the African communities or Middle Eastern communities, it's not that easy to open. So that's really a challenge that we had here. I would say that in my case, what we do here in Multicultural Families Organization is try to open it in a social network kind of group, because if we say like we are like a men's group, just the name be a men's group is really like confronting to be like, I'm going to a men's group, because you start to relate it with mental health issues. You start to relate it with, I need help, with I'm a weak man. So we're trying to use more like the word network in these groups. So men are really more open to come by. When they come by, we talk about networking as well, but they still start to talking about mental health and how to open up. So I think it's a really good approach to doing when men are from different backgrounds. I say just personally. Yeah, I think that might be like my experience with multicultural. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. Anyone else on that before I come to John? On either of those things, online or working with cultural diversity?
Hello, Glenn. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm having some technical issues, but just on the multicultural aspect, and it relates to something you said earlier about people, we need more males working in that sort of community field. I'm very lucky that I do work in that community field, and I'm able to approach and make contact with a lot of the multicultural organizations in our area. And I can go in there and talk to groups of men tell them what we do. I've formed a couple of little groups within those multicultural groups of men. They do their own thing, but sometimes and more often now they're starting to come to the bigger men's walk and talk that we run. And I think it is going to be patience and time and consistency, keep going back to them and keeping that connection going that we need to do.
Great. So that's Bill. For those who don't know, that's Billy in Penrith and the Penrith Men's Walk and Talk. They walk every single week, and I think sort of building what we were talking about with Frank, that communities don't just happen. Often they need to be driven by a passionate and committed individual who's doing the outreach work to bring people in. And an interesting take on the outreach work there is actually Billy going into different multicultural groups and actually helping form smaller groups as a way of building inclusion into the larger groups. That's really insightful, Billy. Thank you for that. Okay, John, I'm going to come to you. You've been waiting patiently. Take us in whichever direction you want to. But unmute yourself first, as we say.
Oh, sorry, mate. I have got my bar that has to come down like a pilot.
Visor down, John.
Yeah, visor down, indeed. And like your slides, really, create more questions than answers, really, which I suppose it's meant to do. But the sense of like all of we take a list there, like the physical initiatives and connection initiatives and so direct kind of social support. We know there are a million reasons why blokes get into situational stress and crisis, right? And I've been struggling with taking it, facing the same problems that all the groups are doing, trying to put men in seats and talk to them and encourage conversations. And we're our own worst enemy, we know that. But one of the things I think, once we start to change the culture, so it's almost like we have to go back, chunk up this whole view, right? And start to go and saying, well, individually, we can deal with the symptoms, but we're almost falling into the clinical trap of medicalizing. Men are not broken. The culture is directing them in a certain direction that isn't resourceful, right? So, is there a culture, multicultural, mentoring men, and John O has worked with the Arabic guys and so on, and they have the same. You've got to go and make it okay. We've got to change the confirmation biases and the stigma biases that are actually preventing men from changing themselves. Because we're not going to go out there and change blokes. You don't make a bloke less fat by telling him not to eat. You make a bloke less fat by having a culture around him that is healthy and nutritionally sound and all of that, and have exercise facilities and access to groups and so on. So I just think it's really important for us to talk about the symptoms and what we can do to alleviate the immediate crisis. But I also think, especially with peak bodies like yourself, mate, it's that time to create the culture discussion, saying, well, stigma is one thing. It's not okay. It's okay to say it's not okay to be, to be not okay, but it's literally not okay to be not okay, right? So until that the truth of that statement changes, we're not really going to make a lot of progress. Men are going to get in the way of helping themselves and others. That's my thought.
Right. Thanks. Thanks, John. And yeah, you talk about chunking up, and to sort of chunk is interesting. So if you chunk it even further outside of men and mateship into sort of social connection work, when people look at social connection, they don't talk about how to individually make every individual who's lonely socially connected. They look at this much broader systemic cultural approach, starting right with economic well-being and community safety, because people can't feel connected in communities that are impoverished and unsafe to even go out of your house. And then you move up to sort of urban planning and building in opportunities to bump into each other and designing in sort of more sort of social connection. And then you get into sort of like developing specific regular collective activities which is what which is the level that many of the groups here are at. They're providing those regular activities, and then you get up to a level of actually, when you get to the individual level, it's not about fixing individuals. It's about actually empowering and employing individuals to have the role to go out and do social connection. And it's not to be the one person that goes and connects with another person. It's about going out and helping that person connect, which is instinctively what people like Frank and Billy are doing.
Absolutely.
But they're not actually, and I'm sure many of the men involved in men's groups are doing. They're helping build community by reaching out and drawing people in. But they're not actually employed as the men's mateship officer for their town, whose role it is to get out there and connect people. And there's actually a case for having those type of roles.
Absolutely. It's a Finnish model. Like in Australia, we build community centres and think the job's done. In Finland, they legislate so that you must attend a community centre, right? So everybody gets, if the asset's there, everyone changes the culture so the asset is utilised the way it should be. So, we should be paying blokes in the community, the concierge model. Absolutely.
Yeah. Got a little bit authoritarian there, John. You must attend a community centre.
Well, the Scandinavians are like that, but
not going to work for the Aussies.
Well,
maybe it will. I don't know. Actually,
well, we just say no one is allowed to attend a community centre, and some of the places are full.
Yeah, they can't tell me that. I'm going there. Yes. Sorry, I went off on my own little personal tangent there. Back to you, good people. Who else wants to jump in, have something to say, and ask about, or contribute, share what you're up to in your community? Okay, Wayne.
Just something I wanted to, I guess, share is over the last couple of years, I've been kind of trying to promote on social media, claiming May 8th for Mates Day. All it is just kind of just a social media push to just to remind each other how valuable mates are, and to reach out to a mate, to connect with a mate, and just all get together and support each other. So I guess if anyone else wants to jump on board and do that, then by all means, let's spread the word.
Yeah, so May 8th, many people
Right.
are trying to get that in the sort of calendar as Mate Day. So use that as an opportunity. And just to build on that, Wayne, we find that when we talk about mateship, we made the theme of International Men's Day last year, making time for mates, and it was super popular. And we're just running a survey at the moment on what the theme for next year will be. We're looking at various things, but we've kept mateship in there, and it really resonates with people. So it's a real important theme. People really get it much more than the average bloke doesn't really get what social connection is necessarily. But you talk about mateship, and people get it. So yeah, we've got a little bit more time. If anyone else wants to sort of chip in some ideas before I move into sort of final thoughts. Jump in or wave a hand. Yeah, Frank.
Glenn, can you hear me?
Yeah, got you now.
Glenn, from the stats that you put up there, it just reinforces the traditional roles that are under attack, basically, by our society. We see the women being nurturers, which is the traditional role of women.
Mm-hmm.
It backs up, research backs up what we've known all along. And the more we attack the family, the less chance blokes have got to form mateship arrangement. I think we need to get, we can't redress everything. We need to get back to traditional roles and traditional views on people's role in society.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, it's certainly the case that men have been very reliant on certain institutions for their social connection, whether that's family, whether that's the workplace with the job for life, sporting groups, and so on and so forth.
When I run the SHED program, I ask the question, who's your hero? And in a lot of cases, it's mum, because
Right.
dad's out of the picture
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
for lots of reasons.
Yeah, sure. And those statistics on who considers mum the most important relationship compared to dad hit me very hard when I saw that from Relationships Australia. Yeah, there's a massive resource there called fathers that we are missing out for many men growing up. I also think it's important, you know, to recognize that sort of that and I put it there deliberately about that, you know, valuing those archetypes of masculinity which clearly still exist, but also evaluating the expanding of gender norms. And I think somehow we need to balance those two and not make it an either or. Like, you know, we've got to go back to 2.4 children and everyone married and all the rest of it, but actually to value what we have, but also open up to more expanded ways of being a man and different approaches, which is why I included like the man with the pram and the guys.
I've never heard of man with a pram.
Yeah, it comes from. Yeah. So to us, it's about the mix and not the either or for us, I think. But the point you're making is very valid and important one. Got a couple of hands. So Frankie, Clive, not heard from you before. So if you want to say hello and where you're from, Frankie.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I found this session really informative. I actually work for a community-controlled health organisation up in Nipamar, and I'm calling or dialing in from Arakoon in Cape York. So the issues that have been raised today are very common across the board. And I think one of the things that was raised just then by Frank actually was around those traditional roles of men. Last year, we had a men's summit where we had about 80 men from across the Cape come together. And the theme of that was around fathers as protectors. And they have other additional responsibilities as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men in terms of cultural custodians of, you know, their history and their knowledges. So there are challenges that we're faced with. Unfortunately, we seem to be in a really heightened mode across the Cape. We've had a really severe succession of suicides, one as recently as last week, and they do tend to be young men. So I'm looking, I guess, and hoping to be a part of this network to help to try to inform what other potential other resources might be out there to help us to have those conversations with younger men around that. I think also the topic of digital addiction is a very real one. We're finding that there is a real disconnect with not only the family unit, but also the social units that exist. And that can obviously then heighten anxiety and depression, which then for us had real adverse effects as well. So helping our communities to understand the impacts of digital addiction is something that I'd like to explore a little bit more. So I just wanted to say thanks. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that contribution. You know, we've talked about men broadly, but there are so many different communities of men, and you've touched on two really important ones there: younger men generally, and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander men. And yet, with all of this, we need to find ways of connecting the many different communities of men there are across Australia. And sometimes it's really great to be with people who share an identity, and that's a really good way of connecting with people. But also, I think we also need to find these ways of learning from each other and what the commonalities are, regardless of whether it's younger men, older men, Aboriginal men, non-Indigenous men, and so on. So yeah, no, thank you. And so sorry to hear about the big challenges that you're dealing with up there in Cape York, particularly with the younger men. Okay, it's 20 past. I've gone 50 minutes. I'd like to wrap up soon. So sort of last call if anyone wants to jump in. Yes, Keith.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, got you, Keith.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. Yeah, I'm based in Bayside, basically in Melbourne. Mm-hmm. Just a couple of thoughts. I mean, first of all, I think the level of connection and friendship certainly seems to vary throughout life. You know, as we go through, we lose close friends, and we then, which is often quite troublesome. Then you how to try to make some new friends again. And the same goes with groups, they tend to vary. So I've certainly experienced that some very close friends have moved interstate, moved overseas, and you kind of lose contact. The other thing is, I think family is very important, and certainly your direct relationship with a wife, partner is pretty critical in terms of support, and that certainly I find that I get a lot of value out of my marriage, I guess. Now I'm involved in one group here in Melbourne, which is the prostate cancer support group in Bayside, and we've been going for a long time, and it goes very well. We meet once a month, and we've been discussing just quite recently. We're starting to think about, okay, maybe we have a need to expand that a little bit in terms of having more contact during the month, so that we don't have this sort of month-to-month sort of program type stuff. And so we're just beginning to talk about that in terms of possibly some social activities, getting together to doing things together and so on. So that's just quite new. So I find today's session quite useful for that as well, in terms of a few thoughts that I've got out of that. Certainly, I also find the same thing that, I belong to a couple of groups, so that works for me, because I've got the prostate support group where we meet once a month. I've got another group where we also meet on another day every month. So that works okay, but it's interesting because one still has a need for more frequent contact than once or twice a month, so that's a constant objective that I'm sort of personally engaged in. So how can I achieve that? But sometimes I've tried a couple of groups, joined them, and then you find, well, the activity just ends up being boring, So you say, well, okay, that's not for me. I'll have to leave that one and go somewhere else. Wow. So there's just some thoughts.
They're really useful, Keith, and a really good reminder. There's a real value in that regularity of a monthly group, but it's not the be all and end all. And having that kind of diversity of ways of connecting and being able to convert those monthly connections into more regular weekly or daily connections is really important too. Thanks for sharing it, and from sharing it from your own personal perspective. It's really helpful. Going to wrap up very shortly, but I see Billy's got his hand up. Billy in Penrith.
Yeah, just to add, what makes us so successful, I think, we have over 11,000 followers on Facebook. We post photographs and videos of what we do every week, and we try and keep things really fresh. So we'll have special nights where that'll focus on maybe Gen Z, that 15 to 25-year-olds. We'll bring sporting clubs, school kids down to the walk. We have tradies nights, which focuses on those tradies that work locally. We have Indigenous nights and all sorts of things like that. We'd bring in guest speakers such as drug and alcohol or gambling and things that blokes are sort of struggling with. And we find that when we do that there, it increases the amount of people coming to our walks. So trying to keep it fresh all the time, you will encourage other people to come along, and especially if they can see that on our Facebook.
Yeah, great, Billy. A really nice example of how the online space, it's not the be all and end all, but it can be a great way of building community if you actually connect it to real world activity, and keep reminding people there's stuff happening, and maybe you're missing out. Come along. So look, I'm going to draw us to a close there. Add any additional points you want to make to finish off in the chat box. If you've got anything you want to share with us, I'm going to put my email down there if you don't already have it. This is the start of a conversation. I mean, we'll continue to have this conversation for many years, I'm sure, but we're doing a distinct piece of work where we're going to develop some policy recommendations based on the conversations we have around social connection. And central to that really will be championing and celebrating the great work that's already happening in men's groups around Australia. I don't think you get anywhere near enough credit for that, and I'm committed to actually shining the spotlight on that. I think we will continue to champion the strength of Aussie men, whilst also recognising there's room for growth and room to expand men's experience of being a man, and many of the groups here are doing that too. I think there are great opportunities around building this social connection conversation. I think the social connection conversation is growing worldwide and in Australia, and we need to make sure that the experiences of men are not missed out within that. But everything I've heard today has given me confidence that we've got something really important to contribute. So I've got loads out of it. As John said earlier on, the slides raised more questions than they provided answers, but that was the point of that. There will be more conversations. In a couple of weeks we'll be doing some best practice showcases, going into more detail of what some of the existing men's groups are doing already, and towards the end of this series we'll be having a much more focus on the answers. John, hopefully we'll be putting together some examples of what we could actually be asking government to do to help support initiatives that build mateship in communities across Australia. So we'll be staying in touch. We'll be keeping you updated with the next events, and we'll be giving you opportunities to comment and contribute to the reports and the proposals that we come up with. But for now, thank you everyone who's contributed. Thanks to Robin for his tech. Thanks to Kim for her creativity on the slides, and thank you all for being part of a fabulous conversation.